Good evening, friends. Today's program has established that whatever may be the weather, the Mumbai West CMEs webinars can continue. So, friends, our webinars can continue in spite of any weather. And thanks to Dr. Akhil Contractor for inviting Dr. Dipti Patel to unlock our knowledge on rheumatology. I request our dynamic secretary, Dr. Shobha Ahuja, practicing at Khar, to introduce Dr. Akhil Contractor and invite him to moderate today's webinar. Friends, before I hand over mic to Dr. Shobha, please note, we also have Mr. Saket Arle from DigiShield. He will be giving us an introduction to telemedicine after Dr. Dipti's talk. I hand over mic to Dr. Shobha Ahuja.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to today's webinar. After the celebration of Eid and Raksha Bandhan, let us come back to our CME programs. Friends, as Dr. Sangvi said, the lockdown and unlock. The lockdown has been extended to 30th of August, but family time is not locked down. Responsibilities are not locked down. Prayers, hobbies, and hopes, they are not locked down. So let us hope for the better future and learn to live with Corona by resuming our work with proper safeguards. Every month, the approach to COVID is altering. Maybe it is because the disease is of the recent origin, but after 4 months, certain guidelines are arrived at with evidence-based medicine by COVID task force doctors. Today, we have invited Dr. Dipti Patel, a rheumatologist, who is going to share with us as how to treat rheumatoid arthritis as per the latest clinical guidelines and evidence-based medicine. Whether we should treat rheumatoid arthritis with a single drug, DMARD, as recommended by the ULAR, a recommendation, or should we use combined DMARDs? Should we give steroids for 6 weeks to 6 months according to COBRA trial or otherwise? And much more. This will be highlighted by Dr. Dipti Patel. And to introduce such a dynamic speaker, I would like to invite the moderator for today's session, Dr. Akhil Contractor, who is a senior family physician, a trustee, a past president, and stalwart of IMA Mumbai West. I invite Dr. Akhil Contractor. Thank you.
I think Dr. Akhil is finding some difficulty. Dr. Dipti, will you mind starting it?
Yes. No, I will definitely. I'm happy to.
I will say Dr. Dipti has been practicing since last more than 10 years, and she has specially got her specialty in rheumatology after completing her post-graduation. I request Dr. Dipti to please take over the mic.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, Dr. Sangvi, and I would like to thank Dr. Shobna for opening such a in a wonderful way. All hopes, and as you say, IMA Mumbai West probably stands for the show must go on. So I think we are here with our webinar and update on different topics. I think in the last 10-20 years, I think the rheumatology, the branch of rheumatology has seen significant changes. And we have evolved as a branch because of the significant improvements in the diagnostic and the therapeutic aspects. So I think what I'm going to do is try and give you a snapshot and update on where we stand with regards to the diagnostic and the therapeutic aspects of rheumatoid arthritis. So just in the next, I think 40 minutes, what we are going to do is try and go through the history of the disease, look at the pathogenesis, which is very important because that helps us to evaluate about the treatment options, discuss the clinical features, and then highlight what is the new aspects in the diagnostic and the treatment management. I'll introduce you to the terms of treat to target and disease activity and remission, which are now very much in the forefront and very commonly used in this treatment of rheumatoid arthritis. So I'll start with this slide. It's very interesting. I think one of the questions which I get from most people, when I introduce myself as a rheumatologist, is that are we seeing more and more cases of rheumatoid arthritis now? Is the incidence increasing? Are autoimmune diseases on the rise? I will probably say I don't have a definite answer to it. We don't know whether the incidence, there is partly definitely a suggestion that the incidence is rising, but these musculoskeletal diseases and these rheumatological illnesses have been plaguing mankind since many, many years. And I think we have evidence of that because we go back to a very respected Ayurveda, Charak Samhita from so many years ago in 200, 300 BC. They have described joint problems with inflammation. Also in 400 BC with Hippocrates describing joint problems with suggestion of inflammation in the joints. And it was only in the later part of the 18th century that a British physician, Sir Alfred Garrard, coined the term rheumatoid arthritis and gave the description of this disease. For most of you who must be interested in paintings, I know paintings don't kind of correlate directly with scientific evidence, but if you go and see paintings from the 15th and 16th century, they have depicted changes in hands and feet of in the pictures, which probably depict that there were changes of arthritis and these joint problems existing even then. So yes, I think we're probably talking about a very, very old disease in a new shell now. So the exact cause of rheumatoid arthritis, I don't think we know it as of yet, but with the recent research and evolution, we are now pretty certain that it is a multifactorial disease. It is a combination of the genetic stimulus and the environmental factors which plays in developing rheumatoid arthritis. In the genetic risk, about 60% of patients with rheumatoid arthritis have a very strong genetic correlation. So you will find that asking family history, if a first degree relative like a sister, brother, mother has rheumatoid arthritis or autoimmune diseases, your chances of developing the disease is probably threefold. If you have a second degree relative in the family having autoimmune diseases, probably the chances are twofold. So there's definitely a very strong genetic link. And this strong genetic predisposition lies in the HLA-DR1 genes. So that is the strongest genetic predisposition, which we called as the shared epitope. And that probably explains why the monozygotic twins are often more associated with developing rheumatoid arthritis and autoimmune disease. We now also understand that environment plays a very big role in triggering this condition. So any kind of infection, it is not uncommon for people. I think particularly now post-monsoon, we'll have a lot of dengue, we'll have a lot of other viral infections and chikungunya. And after infections, most likely, these people who are genetically susceptible tend to then have a trigger in the immune system and develop rheumatoid arthritis. So infection, any kind, bacterial, can have a predisposing reason for precipitating rheumatoid arthritis. Also, we understand that in the environmental lifestyle changes, smoking plays a very important role. So you'll find smokers who are already genetically predisposed. Smoking produces the anti-CCP antibodies, or rather precipitates the production of it. And hence you find that most of the smokers have a high chance of developing rheumatoid arthritis, which if already they have an existing genetic risk. So these are some of the environmental factors that we understand. There is also an interesting link between the dental infection. So we know that P. gingivalis, there's a high incidence of this kind of organism which is found in the oral cavity, which can lead to developing this infection. So it's very interesting. There's a multifactorial reason, but this is all what leads to the immune system triggering, and that results in the cytokine upregulation and dysfunction of the cells. So you all will have to believe me that this is probably the simplest slide that I could find to explain the pathophysiology of a very complex disease. We must understand that rheumatoid is a complex disease, and because of understanding this pathophysiology, today we are able to provide treatment, and we can target the individual. We've got molecules which target the individual cytokines, which results in such dramatic improvement of patients. So understanding the pathophysiology has certainly been the game changer for rheumatoid arthritis. So as mentioned before, if we have a patient, so in the pathophysiology, I would say that in rheumatoid arthritis, it is all the cells lines which are affected, right? From T cells to B cells, it is all the cells lines which are affected in the uh, pathophysiology of rheumatoid arthritis. So if we have a patient who is genetically susceptible, has an environmental trigger, then what is happening essentially at the immunological level is that you have the antigen presenting cell which activates the T cell. So it is a mainly B cell regulated disease, but you have the activation of T cells initially by the antigen presenting cells, which leads to the release of cytokines. So anti-TNF, IL-1, I think we are all getting more familiar with COVID as well, the inflammatory cytokine storm that we talk about. So these are all the cytokines which are initially released. And these released cytokines and the activated T cells itself activate the B cells. The B cells in turn divide into the antibody producing plasma cells, and immune complexes are formed, which are your rheumatoid factor and anti-CCP, which lead to the activation of the complements. And once the complements are activated, you have the inflammatory cascade. So when this is activated, you have the release of all the cytokines, which range from IL-10, IL-6, alpha TNF, and all these then result in the inflammatory process, which directly attack the articular cartilage, the osteoclasts and the chondrocytes, which results in all the clinical manifestation, and then the joint damage and subsequently the deformities. So this is basically a very snapshot explanation of such a complex disease at what's happening at the molecular level. So coming to rheumatoid arthritis, why are we talking about rheumatoid arthritis is basically because it is more common than we think. It globally, I think the incidence is around 1%, and I think it is similar in India as well. So if you can imagine, it's a chronic inflammatory disease which is affecting about 1% of the population. So for a highly populous country like India, you can expect that there will be millions of people who are having rheumatoid arthritis or some form of inflammatory arthritis. So it becomes very important to have the knowledge and understanding about diagnosing and treating this condition. Like most of the autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis is also 3 times more common in women. So amongst the risk factors, apart from what we mentioned, the genetic factors, female sex are usually more affected with rheumatoid arthritis and autoimmune diseases. This is probably due to, again, there are hypotheses, but it's probably linked to the hormonal changes and the estrogen and progesterone cycles. But yes, this is something which is more common. Most of our patients tend to be women. And in the age group, I think there is no age which is spared with rheumatoid arthritis or inflammatory conditions, but we see a peak, and we see that around the age of 40 to 60. Majority of the patients are in this productive age group. So it can be as early as, as we know about the juvenile onset as well. But most in the adulthoods, we see them between the age group of 30 to 60. Most patients beyond 65 years, which we call the old onset of rheumatoid arthritis, they tend to present with more multi-system features, which we'll come to in a bit. So I'll just put this slide up. So as you can see on this, with the picture with the black background and the one with the gray background, I've put up a question saying who has RA, and I think it is quite straightforward. Everybody would probably say this is what we have been exposed to. This is the classical textbook pictures. If we open all our textbooks now of medicine, in the rheumatology section, we find this picture for rheumatoid arthritis, because for us, this is arthritis with classical Z-form deformity and subluxation. We have the boutonnieres and the swan neck deformities. But this is essentially a late rheumatoid arthritis, or probably untreated or poorly treated rheumatoid arthritis. What we are now going to focus in this era is about diagnosing rheumatoid arthritis at this stage, where we may have very subtle features, and probably that is where we need to distinguish the early onset rheumatoid arthritis to prevent getting to this textbook picture of rheumatoid arthritis. So the question here, who has RA? Yes, we know this is a long-standing deforming RA, but yes, this picture will definitely very well say that this could definitely be RA, but needs more information. So what information are we going to have? The clinical presentation. The clinical presentation of your patients is going to determine, I think most of us physicians, musculoskeletal problems form the crux, or rather it's kind of the main symptoms that people come to. You know, I think 20-30% of consultations, or even in other specialties when you're seeing, they will probably mention about a few aches and pains, joint pains bothering them. And I think joint pains are so common. So what distinguishes, what are the features that you need to be aware about while evaluating a history of joint pains? And I think these are the typical features that we look out for is the symptom onset. So anybody presenting with joint symptoms less than, for more than 6 weeks, what we call the acute onset. So anybody having any joint pains which have been lasting for over a month, over 6 weeks, then we need to try and take more history about what kind of joint pain it is, what are the associated symptoms. And I think a very quick way of doing it is your S factor. This is a campaign which was kind of, you know, launched by the EULAR, European League of Rheumatology, where they say that if you have anybody presenting with joint pains in your community and you want a very quick way of evaluating whether this is inflammatory or non-inflammatory, whether this is going to a rheumatologist or not going to a rheumatologist, this is probably going to be helpful in your busy practice, because you can't have a detailed history about joint pains like we do, but you could probably say, does the patient have S factor? So you're going to look out for your 3 S's. So of this lecture, if you forget everything else today, no problem. But what I want a take home message today is to understand that if you have a patient presenting with joint pains about 4 to 6 weeks in onset, you need to ask them, do we have the associated S factor with that, which stands for stiffness. So anybody who presents with joint pains and has an early morning stiffness, so particularly after waking up from sleep, has a stiffness which is lasting for more than 30 minutes. So anybody having a stiffness for more than 30 minutes to an hour, and that getting better with movement. So this is very important history. So they're getting up, feeling locked up, feeling seized, and then they walk to the bathroom, they probably have a hot water shower or start brushing their teeth, and after half an hour, 45 minutes to an hour, by the time it's midday, most people start feeling better. So stiffness which improves with exercise is definitely a pointer towards inflammatory disease, because most of your non-inflammatory condition and joint pains will get worse after exertion. So that is an important aspects. We ask about swelling. So any associated swelling in the joints. Now this can be quite subjective. Most of the times, I think with the very early onset rheumatoid arthritis, the swelling may be something which is there in the morning, may disappear by the time they have come to consultation in the evening. But definitely a history of swelling in the small joints, particularly with their rings getting stuck, they are, you know, not able to grip in the morning. Those are all the symptoms that we ask for associated with small joint problems. And squeezing. So by the time they are in your clinic, a quick squeeze test. We do individual all joint examination, but a quick way of asserting in your clinic would be to squeeze their hands and feet. So a squeezing test, because that you're going to do your MCP squeeze test and your MTP, so your feet. So quick squeeze test like shaking your hands, MCP, MTP squeeze test. On squeezing, if the patient is going to have a lot of discomfort and pain, that your squeeze test is positive, and that probably indicates that there could be an underlying inflammatory pathology. So yes, any joint pains, duration, involvement of the joint, small joint, large joint, and the 3 S's, which are your swelling, stiffness, and squeezing test. But as I mentioned, most people will present to us with a lot of other multi-system, or rather more, a variety of other symptoms apart from the joints. They can describe a low-grade fever. So usually fever ends up a very systematic evaluation is done to exclude infection and the rest of the things. And then when no cause of fever is found, we usually get patients with what we call PUO, pyrexia of unknown origin, and we evaluate them, and it's not surprising for us to get a patient of inflammatory disease like rheumatoid or autoimmune disease like SLE. So fever can be an accompanying feature. Weight loss. There are some people who have significant weight loss and they always worry, and we also have to worry about significant weight loss, saying whether it's a neoplastic process, because sometimes in the elderly age group of more than 65, 70 presenting with a new rheumatoid arthritis with significant weight loss and loss of appetite, we also worry whether this is a neoplastic presentation as such. So we evaluate that, and tiredness and fatigue inflammation will cause that. So it is a very non-specific feature, but it can be very disabling and debilitating to the patients. And again, as I would show in my next slide, rheumatoid arthritis is a clinical conundrum. It is not only the joints which are affected. You have a lot of what we call extra-articular manifestations. So joints are a part, but especially in India with very long-standing rheumatoid arthritis, poor control, and poor disease treatment compliance, we have a lot of patients who are what we call burnt out rheumatoid arthritis, who can be predisposed to complications as far as developing gangrene in their toes and fingers. So they can develop what we call rheumatoid vasculitis. We also get referrals from ophthalmologists. So it will be very common for ophthalmologists to see episcleritis and scleritis. A patient having recurrent episodes of them, we always have ophthalmologists referring to us, trying to establish if there is an underlying autoimmune reason for it, on why they are having at least an episode of episcleritis, once every month or so on. So we get a lot of referrals from our ophthalmology colleagues retrospectively when they present with eye symptoms. Again, subcutaneous nodules, so that some people may dismiss as just the fatty lumps or so on, but subcutaneous nodules particularly found on your extensor aspect of the elbow, a very typical sites for having the rheumatoid arteries, which are quite firm to hard, really. And they can have underlying what we call the lung involvement. So we don't screen all of our patients, but most of our patients, if we have got a background for some reason, we get a CT scan or a chest x-ray, it is not unusual to get lung involvement in rheumatoid arthritis, which can vary from rheumatoid nodules in the lungs, which can be sometimes mistaken for neoplasm or cavitating infections. Or you can have what we call the interstitial fibrosis, which is mainly the SIP pattern, which we call the rheumatoid arthritis interstitial lung disease. So it's not only the joints, it's a multi-system involvement. And again, we get more and more interested because we now know that inflammation is a basis, and it is a pathology which we find in most of the cardiovascular problems and the cerebrovascular events. They're all associated with underlying inflammation, resulting in accelerated atherosclerosis. So similarly, patients with rheumatoid arthritis, it's not just about the joints. Because of active inflammation, and because these patients, if they're not treated with and controlled the inflammation better, they are more predisposed to developing MIs and strokes. So it is extremely important that these patients are on our annual review, not only to control rheumatoid arthritis, but also to monitor the cardiovascular risk factors and adjust the medications for blood pressure, risk factors for diabetes, and the rest of the parameters to prevent any kind of cerebrovascular or cardiovascular risks. So coming to what is new in the diagnostic criteria, till date, I think till 2010, we were using the 1987 criteria from the American College of Rheumatology. But in 2010, we've come up with a new classification criteria, which is very broad. The initial classification criteria was very specific and was very stringent with regards to establishing a diagnosis for rheumatoid arthritis. But now what we understand is that there is a lot of inflammatory joint diseases, and we rather have a classification criteria which can pick up inflammatory arthritis early from the community. So we have got all these, so this is probably more, again, can be quite helpful in the clinical practice to have it on your desktop or nearby when you have joint problems, because this can give you a little prediction of probably whether you're dealing with an inflammatory problem or not, and whether this is something which goes to referring on to a rheumatologist or not, because it takes into account and gives scores and points even for joint involvement up to 1 joint to more than 10 joints, it involves your clinical parameters, it involves your laboratory investigations as well. So this is again quite useful. Coming to the investigations modality, I always say in all my lectures that I think with rheumatology, we are very traditional. I think investigations is an important aspect we understand, but is only a small part of the jigsaw puzzles. Most often, I find that the rheumatological investigations can confuse physicians. So when requested and when you get the test, you are as confused before and after the test, because it's about the interpretation of the results, which is very important in context with the clinical history and examination. So your diagnosis of inflammatory joint diseases or rheumatological conditions, the majority of it, like with I think most of them, is made on the clinical history and examination. So that is the most important aspect. And investigation is the part of the jigsaw puzzle which we fit in. And then if everything comes together, yes, I think it becomes quite important that we can establish a diagnosis. So for establishing diagnosis, as I said, we apply the clinical criteria. We do simple tests like your inflammatory markers, ESR and CRP. Both are fine. I think CRP becomes a little bit more expensive for more routine monitoring, but ESR and CRP both are utilized. We have an advantage with CRP because sometimes if the CRP is very high, we can always ensure that there is no underlying infection. So sometimes we use ESR CRP and ensure that, you know, the CRP, if it is quite significantly elevated, most of our patients can come in with overlapping infections, and I think that helps us to distinguish the two. In terms of imaging modalities, I think we are now not requesting x-rays on the first, because you're going to have patients who come in the 6 weeks of symptoms onset, 8 weeks of symptom onset. X-rays are not going to reveal a lot. Probably in the initial stages you may find a little bit of periarticular osteopenia and so on, but really for such early onset, if there is a doubt, so I have a doubt in the clinic that there is some degree, so it is very difficult, especially patients with high BMI, to ascertain whether there is real swelling in the joints. And there may be some people who are, and there must be subjective tenderness, so you don't know whether there is really inflammation or whether these tender joints are really like subjective soft tissue tenderness. So we've got quite significant advances in ultrasound and MRI to detect even subtle inflammation. So for a small proportion of people that we are in doubt, we can get an ultrasound and we can look at the, so I'll show you in the next slide, we look at the Doppler activity, we look at the activity in the synovium, and we can detect very early onset rheumatoid arthritis. We'll speak about the specific tests, the rheumatoid factor and the anti-CCP antibodies. And also in investigations, we often come across once we put them on medications, we always need at least once or every 2 months, we need some of the parameters like your full blood count and especially the liver function test for monitoring our drugs. So that is again the part of investigations that we are commonly dealing with. So talking about the most common test, which is, most patients with joint pains, I think they are also quite familiar. They themselves go and get a rheumatoid factor done. So it's a very old style test, has got its own values, but we know that it has its limitation as well. Yes, in a population of rheumatoid arthritis, 70% of patients with rheumatoid arthritis will have a rheumatoid factor positive, but then it can be falsely positive as well. 5 to 10% of population can have a rheumatoid factor with no problems at all. And yes, there is a seronegative variety. So as I said, even if the rheumatoid factor comes back negative, the patient could very well have rheumatoid arthritis, because 30 to 40% of patients of rheumatoid arthritis will have it negative, and that is what we call a seronegative rheumatoid arthritis. So it's only your clinical history and examination in these cases which will help you to reach the appropriate diagnosis. And again, a rheumatoid factor, just a positive rheumatoid factor down treatment as rheumatoid arthritis, we need to be aware that rheumatoid factor can be positive even in conditions like hepatitis C or other connective tissue diseases, or even something like lymphoma, infective endocarditis. So we can go down a very different route altogether, which can be catastrophic if we are not entirely certain about interpreting the tests. So what we have is, we have the good news that we have got anti-CCP antibodies. So these are more specific. It's anti-cyclic, citrullinated cyclic peptide antibody. These are antibodies which are more highly specific and sensitive, up to 98%. So if you have this antibody positive, then there are probably not other conditions which have anti-CCP positivity. Let's put it that way. And it has both diagnostic as well as prognostic value. So we know that anti-CCP can be detected very early in rheumatoid arthritis. In fact, most studies have shown that positivity. And we also have followed up patients where, you know, they have been anti-CCP positive with no signs and symptoms. And most of these patients after 2 or 3 years have developed rheumatoid arthritis. So it has both a diagnostic ability and prognosis. Prognosis wise, if you are anti-CCP positive, you're rheumatoid factor positive, it says that you are more, you're at a risk of having more aggressive disease. So you're going to have diseases which is more erosive in nature and requires aggressive treatment. But I'm certainly, what we need to take away the point from here is that rheumatoid factor and anti-CCP should not be serially monitored. So there's no value in keeping on kind of, you know, testing them during the treatment, that your rheumatoid factor has gone from 200 to 100 or 65. We got a lot of patients who self-test them and say that mera RA kam hua, mera RA upar gaya. But that is simply wasting the resources because we don't monitor anti-CCP and rheumatoid factor for disease activity. So as I mentioned about the musculoskeletal ultrasound, this is just a little overview of what we see. But musculoskeletal ultrasound, what we need to understand is that you need to have a sonologist who is dedicated and has been trained to do musculoskeletal ultrasound, because it can be very user sensitive, user dependent, and interpreting that is also very sensitive. So, you know, what you essentially see in an inflamed joints, like one of the MCP joints, what you're seeing here with the power Doppler signal is all the increased vascularity. So in some patients, then all this can signify there is a lot of disease activity, which we probably may not be able to pick up clinically, and hence we can then escalate their treatment to achieve remission. So this has been quite helpful. So coming on to the treatment aspect, this is a very important picture which I show all my patients. So whenever my patients are in the clinic, whenever I'm counseling my patients in the clinic, I put up this picture on the desktop and I say that why it is important to adhere to treatment and be compliant with your treatment is basically because we are dealing with rheumatoid arthritis in stages. If they have been lucky enough, and most of them are now with good referrals, most of these patients are coming to me in this stage, which is the early RA, which you saw in the first picture as well, where there is no deformities. There is obviously symptoms of a lot of stiffness, pain, swelling, but no deformity. So this is the time when they need to be counseled about the chronicity of this condition, why it is important to take the disease, because important to take the disease seriously is because if we leave it untreated, then slowly but surely it is going to progress, and it's not going to happen over a matter of days, but yes, in years time, where it is then going to progress to develop all these deformities, which unfortunately then in the late stage are going to be permanent. So this is where the counseling part is very important. So I think like most of our I think rheumatology did not want to lag behind. We have cardiologists who talk about the golden hour. We have neurologists who speak about the golden period, about you know, their thrombolysis. Rheumatologists as well, we want to be in the league. So what we are talking about now is the window of opportunity. So what we are essentially talking about is early diagnosis, early treatment, achieving disease remission, so that we are now talking in the future whether or not we can reach a stage where we can actually reach a stage of disease-free remission. So we are talking about using drugs to achieve remission, but we are also probably in the future, if we have a lot of early detection, putting on early aggressive treatment, reaching a remission, we may probably be able to reach even a stage where we are then going to be offering patients a disease or remission with without drugs. So that is something that we are going to be striving for. But for that, it is very important that we recognize that there's a window of opportunity in the first 12 weeks. So your 3 months from the time of symptom onset is very important to get the diagnosis and get them on aggressive management of treatment and get into remission in the first 3 or 6 months. So that the common question that patients ask me, how long the treatment? I very openly say it's any disease like high blood pressure, diabetes, thyroid, like you take your medications long term, it is going to be a long term condition. But if they've come to me early and they are there to treatment, I say after 2 years, we can review the situation. So we give them hope that if 2 years of very good treatment and their disease responds, we may be talking now about. So I think that is a very important aspect of the future. So there's a significant paradigm shift in the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis. What we used to do in the past, the old approach was, due to limitations of investigations and treatment options, was let's treat the symptoms. Patients are tired of pain, we'll give them painkillers and we settle their pain down. So it was more emphasis on treating the symptoms rather than the disease itself. There was less aggressive treatment because all the drugs which were available were far more toxic. So to prevent the toxicity, there was always a balance, and what ended up being was a was more of a untreated rheumatoid or inflammatory arthritis. Whereas with now the better understanding of drugs, with the better understanding of the safety profile and the availability of so many drugs, we are now kind of focusing on limiting not only the symptoms. We want the patient to have a good quality life, limitation of pain, good use of their joints, but also trying to ensure that we don't develop any destruction of joints. So we are looking at the radiological parameters. So we don't want any kind of radiological damage, which can be achieved with the aggressive use of the disease modifying drugs, your first line therapy, your combination therapy, which we'll speak about, and then the game changers, which have been the biologics. So this slide kind of, very nicely portrays that why we have been, not in the forefront, because until the 19th century, really, we didn't have many drugs, or probably all these drugs which are listed for the treatment have been more for symptomatic management, and they had their own toxic side effects. So using gold injections was associated with a lot of nephrotoxicity. Again, steroids, we know long term have been doing a lot of damage. So it was only in the late 1980s that we started developing treatment options, which we now understand better, and we are using it in a way that we can balance the safety profile and the disease remission. And then, as I said, in the last 10-20 years, the use of biologics has certainly changed the field of rheumatoid arthritis. So when we talk about steroids, I think, like my patients, I think with all of us doctors, the moment I say that we are going to put you on steroids, there is always this raise of eyebrows, and the patients are like, I've heard a lot of bad things. There's a lot of bad publicity about steroids, which is absolutely fine. These are drugs which are to be used with a lot of caution. We all know that the potential side effects. But really, what we use steroids now is for a bridging treatment. So what we need to follow, I always explain to my patient, is there's a point A and we need to get to point B. The point A is that your disease is very active. You've got a lot of inflammation. What we need to do is we need to cross this bridge smoothly and get to point B, where we can control your inflammation quickly. And that is what we're going to achieve by use of steroids. We can use oral steroids, short course of oral steroids. When I mean short course, we are not using steroids more than 4 to 6 weeks. So in 4 to 6 weeks, we are probably using oral steroids, Visalone, Omnacotil, those kind of drugs that you've heard about. We are using them at low doses, probably 20-30 milligrams to start off with, tapering it every probably 15 days, and probably then after 4 to 6 weeks, so maximum up to a 2 month course of reducing steroids, we are then able to stop these steroids if we are going to use the disease modifying drugs. So this is a very kind of, smooth tapering approach that we take for steroids. And yes, we don't use long-term steroids, because then you're going to have, as you say, from the smooth approach, you're going to really have your patients which are going to be broken with a lot of side effects. Intra-articular injections are another good option, because some of my patients may be doing well in their disease course and all their joints may be fine, but it may be just 1 or 2 joints which end up bothering them. and then using just a small dose of cortisone in localized areas seem to settle the symptoms, and of course does not carry the multi-system side effects. So intraarticular joint injections in selected patients is also a very good option. So it is about using the steroids very cautiously, and we get the maximum benefit of it. Coming to disease modifying drugs, I think we all are very familiar with the drugs used as a first line therapy, methotrexate, sulfasalazine, and of course the very famous hydroxychloroquine in this time has received good press, been made a hero and then a villain as well. So hydroxychloroquine has suddenly, the humble drug has become very famous, but we have been using that for more than now 30-40 years. So the therapy involves a double therapy. So most of our recommendation is to start most of the patients with rheumatoid arthritis on double therapy, especially the anti-CCP, antibody positive, because these are aggressive patients. These are aggressive diseases. So we usually start with a therapy, a combination of methotrexate and hydroxychloroquine, very safe, because hydroxychloroquine we think is a very mild drug to be just used by itself. But along with methotrexate, it works very well. So this is the most commonest combination that you will find. Unless there is a patient who is not able to tolerate methotrexate, or there are female patients in the reproductive age group. So if they're planning for a family, then we don't put them on the methotrexate initially, because they need to be off methotrexate at least for 3 months before they think about conceiving. So taking that into account, we use several combinations. We can use methotrexate and hydroxychloroquine. We can use methotrexate sulfasalazine. We use methotrexate sulfasalazine and hydroxychloroquine as triple therapy. And sometimes we also use at, for very aggressive diseases, and for most of these combinations when they've failed, in some people you may also find that they have used low dose of methotrexate and leflunomide. However, it's a caution, because both drugs can affect the liver quite adversely. So, we always have to monitor the liver test and use the dosages very carefully. But the most common combination you'll find methotrexate, sulfasalazine, hydroxychloroquine. And these drugs again have to be used at optimum doses and have to be escalated. So there's no point putting a patient just on 5 and 7.5 milligrams of methotrexate and leaving them at that. It is about every 2 weeks, 3 weeks, escalating the dose, reaching up to the maximum dose, monitoring their LFTs, and time to establish if that dose is suitable and has aimed to achieve what we call the remission. So coming to biologics, I think there are all these tongue twister names which probably you become quite familiar with. These are some of the biologics that I have listed which are available. And this goes back to the slide that I had shown before of the pathogenesis. So if you saw that there were anti-TNF is the main TNF, your tumor necrosis factor alpha, which was a very major cytokine in driving the pathophysiology. We've got TNF blockers, which essentially are your adalimumab and etanercept. So these are what we call the monoclonal antibodies, which can be subcutaneous injections weekly or every 15 days, very convenient to administer. We have got even the very old and probably the first biologic, which was infliximab, which is given in the intravenous form. This is partly human and partly mouse-based antibody. But we've got a very modern ones like the adalimumab, etanercept, which work very well. And that is where at individual levels, so as I said, with pathophysiology, we've got drugs which block the B cell directly. So your rituximab. So rituximab is a B cell blocker drug. We have got drugs like your anti-TNF blockers like etanercept, adalimumab, infliximab, which blocks the alpha TNF. You've got the IL-1 inhibitors, anakinra. We also have tocilizumab, which is certainly now currently in use with the inflammatory cytokine storm in COVID, which blocks the activity of IL-6. Again, a very big driver in most of our autoimmune diseases, especially JIA, adult onset Still's disease. We use a lot of tocilizumab. And the most recent update that I can give you about the biologics is that most of them were in these injectable forms, but we've now got biologics in India which are in their oral form. So we've got what we call JAK inhibitors. Your JAK inhibitors like baricitinib and tofacitinib, they are the drugs which are in oral form. So that is probably the latest in the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis for people who can be injection phobic or for some reason don't prefer injections. It's just a once a day medication, just one pill. And those are the oral biologics, which are quite potent. So again, quite significant advances in terms of administration as well. So do all the people require biologics? I think this is again a very, what we have simplified is that we know that patients who run high disease activity and you've used at least 2 combination therapies for now 6 months and they still have a very high disease activity, then certainly it is the time to start talking about the use of biologics in these patients. And how do you calculate? We calculate the disease activity is not just subjective. We have got objective assessments tool as well. We've got what we call the disease activity score, which is a very simple marker. If you Google search as well, disease activity score, there's a calculator which comes up. And what we essentially do is we put down the number of tender joints in there, the number of swollen joints, the marker of inflammation at that point, ESR, CRP, and then we take a patient global scale from 1 to 10. And when you put that in the calculator and calculate, you'll get scores which range from 2.6 to 5.1. And this essentially gives us an idea that if your disease activity is falling between remission, so anybody who has a low disease activity, less than 2.6, disease is well controlled. Anybody between 2.6 is low disease activity, maybe we could alter and escalate the doses of disease modifying drugs. Similarly, moderate disease activity. But if a patient is constantly having a value of more than 5.1 on their disease activity score, then it definitely corresponds to a high disease activity, which requires aggressive treatment, and biologics should certainly be considered in these patients. So we've seen a lot of clinical aspect of rheumatoid arthritis, right from the diagnosis, investigations, the treatment, the future outlook of most rheumatologists, the researchers are working on. But really all that remains a tip of the iceberg. What we see in our day-to-day practice with patients, I think what we should not miss is that these chronic disease carry a lot of burden. There is emotional burden, there are family issues, issues at work, there's a feeling of helplessness, a lot of anxiety, depression, and chronic pain as well becomes a part and parcel of these conditions. So I think this is kind of approaching this disease like any other chronic disease as a whole. And I think that's why a holistic approach is very essential. So apart from your symptomatic drug treatments to your disease modifying drugs, using the high end drugs, a lot of patients require a lot of psychosocial intervention. So giving them the hope, hopefully having support groups, speaking to people who've been through the similar process. And I always kind of encourage them to pick up any kind of exercises, any kind of hobbies, because these are the things which are going to be very important in the long term. And again, surgical interventions, we've got our orthopedic colleagues. So with people who are still there with a lot of deformities and disabilities, we've got orthopedic surgeons and plastic surgeons who can now kind of reconstruct and kind of improve the use of damaged joints as well. So I think that is very heartening, because we still have hope with a group of patients with modern surgical interventions. So I think just before I end this talk, I would like to give you an example about where we were and where we are now. So suddenly, if you compare these two patients from the 1980s, so, a lady who was diagnosed with rheumatoid in the 80s at age of 30 was managed only symptomatically. And now when she sees me after so many years, she has got joints which are damaged, hip replacement, shoulder surgeries, has complications with osteoporosis. There's a lot of anxiety and depression, as opposed to a lady who's now at a similar age group in this era, at the age of 29, struggled with joint symptoms for 1 year, then got through the right process, had to quit the job as well because of a lot of limitations, and then came to us diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, kept on double therapy, triple therapy, monitored, is in remission, and now kind of fully independent, living a good quality of life, and even planning to start a family. So I think that kind of significantly a short story, just simplifying that what rheumatoid arthritis patients used to be 30 years ago as opposed to being diagnosed right now, the outlook has certainly changed. So the picture that I put up, I think we certainly need to make this, obsolete. This is not acceptable in the 21st century. This is only for the textbook, but we should not have our patients reaching this stage. So with that, I would like to end my talk. And as I mentioned about support group, we've been actively involved as a group of rheumatologists to bring a patient support group in Mumbai, Mission Arthritis, which we are getting registered, hoping to reach out to people across Mumbai and across India to help them cope with the disease better. So thank you so much for your attention and the opportunity. I'd like to thank IMA Mumbai West for
Dr.
the
Dipti, there are
opportunity.
few
Dr.
questions.
Dipali. Yes.
Before I hand over mic to our moderator, Dr. Akhil Contractor,
Yes.
Madam, one question. The benefit at present mentioned for the COVID of hydroxychloroquine, can it be because of its tumor necrotising factor and other properties, or rather it is affecting the virus?
No, so hydroxychloroquine has no effect on the TNF level, but the hypothesis is that in COVID, what they're trying to say is the hydroxychloroquine is trying to neutralize the the lysosome activity, and the pH is kind of altered. So what happens is that the uptake of rather the release of the virus is kind of stopped.
That's storm.
So I think that was the no, the storm, the hydroxychloroquine, I don't think has a particular role with regards to the storm.
Okay. So
yes, tocilizumab acts at IL-6 particularly. So your IL-6 determines your inflammatory cytokine storm. So that is a blocker there.
Okay. Madam, one more question. This is a personal question. What is the relation between the liver and the rheumatology?
So liver, directly rheumatoid and liver involvement, I think is, we don't see, I mean, in other autoimmune diseases, probably
Then
we
why,
see.
Madam, then why did you go to Liverpool to study the rheumatology?
Liverpool?
You did your graduation and post-graduation from Liverpool, madam?
Yes, I did. Yes, I spent about, I was in the UK for 13 years, and in the city of Liverpool, I did all my training. Yes.
Before I cover the Thanksgiving, we will invite Mr. Dipen Mehta from DigiShield to give us an introduction to the telemedicine. Mr. Dipen is available. Mr. Dipen Mehta.
Yes, sir.
Please. Yeah, you are unmute now. Please. I will like to have a small introduction from you. Our people will like to know how the telemedicine can be useful to us.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Sanghvi, and IMA Mumbai West for giving us opportunity to present the webinar. Mr. Sanket Baral is our founder chairman of DigiShield. He is also a founder of FigMD, a Pune-based company which is backed by Google Ventures that manages almost 40% of US citizen data. So his experience is like more than 20 years in IT healthcare. So we have developed a product which is called DigiShield. It's an AI-based power solution software which uses artificial intelligence to help doctor understand the COVID carrier risk of the patient. Before the patient visit to the clinic, doctor can have risk assessment of their patients, like if patient is high risk, low risk, or medium risk of COVID. It analyzes like 14 to 17 parameters of the patients, and accordingly give the results to the doctor, like the patient visiting to the clinic is of high risk or low risk. So it also gives the digital consent to the patient. It also provides teleconsultation, video consultation. It has touchless payment collection, appointment booking, various other features are there. It's available free for the doctors to entire IMA members. You can download it from iOS and as well as Android Play Store. I will just share you one video to get to know like how it works.
Download the DigiShield app from the Play Store or App Store now. New users will go through a quick one-time registration process. After filling in some basic information, registration is complete and you can start using DigiShield. Logging into DigiShield is easy, safe and secure. Enter your registered mobile number. An OTP is sent to your mobile. Enter the OTP and you are logged in. No passwords to forget. Making a patient's appointment is easy. Just click on the calendar sign, enter the patient's name and mobile number. Select date and time of the appointment and that's it. A confirmation message will be sent to the patient and so will a reminder. A day before the appointment, your patient will be automatically contacted by the DigiShield agent. The Shield agent will collect the patient's symptoms, history of present illness and more. The agent will also collect any consents or indemnity that you want to collect from them. Based on the DigiShield interaction, you will be alerted to the patient corona carrier risk. It's easy to do a phone or a video consultation with the patient. DigiShield recommends that patients that have been flagged with a high or moderate corona carrier risk should be consulted via consultation first. Click on the phone icon or the video icon to do a safe and secure teleconsultation with the patient. In order to issue an e-prescription to a patient, tap on the pencil icon, tap on the camera icon to take a photo of the prescription and you're all set. The prescription is sent securely to the patient immediately. DigiShield is easy to use and you will be online within 5 minutes of downloading the app. Download DigiShield on the Android Play Store or Apple App Store today. Protect yourself, your patients, your community. Download DigiShield for free today.
Just would recommend doctors to take the benefit of the application and start downloading. It's like free for the doctors. If you have like any query, you can just log on to
I would like to know two
www.digishield.
things. One
Yes,
is
yes.
whether when we do the teleconsultations, you know, the main our worry is regarding the maintaining the record, and second is the consultation charges. Now, because of all this present net banking problems, how secure will be our system for receiving the payment or maintaining the patient's accounts, or we require to have another SIM or another mobile for that specifically for telemedicine?
No. It's like all is there in one application. Patient will pay through the SMS link. Once doctor book the appointment, doctor can enter the amount or the consulting fees what doctor wants to receive. So patient will get the link through SMS. Patient need to just click on the link and make the payment.
Okay.
The patient doesn't need to download any application or something. And the teleconsultation, video consultation, even the medical records are maintained. So we have like option in the patient option. Once patient has been registered, one time doctor need to register the patient. Once patient has been registered, their prescription, previous medical records, the number of time patient visited, everything is being maintained and recorded in the patient's name. You can search by patient first name, last name or mobile number. The payment is also like it's HTTPS certified link. So it will be through third party Razorpay. So everything is secure and end-to-end encrypted.
Usually in the beginning there may take some time, but overall the telemedicine will save the time for doctors, or it will aid the work to the doctor?
It will definitely save, because doctor just need to register with the mobile number. Rest all patient needs to fill the details. You need to have our AI chatbot will ask the question to the patients, and patient just need to enter his symptoms, and doctors can view the symptoms of the patient, and accordingly doctor can do the teleconsultation. So it's not the main thing is patient doesn't require the application. through
Okay.
the link, patient can join the video consultation. And
Okay.
after the video consultation is completed, the doctor can write the prescription which the currently doctor are used to, and just
Okay.
click the upload button and send the prescription to the patient. Patient will receive the soft copy as well.
Mhm.
So it's like touchless prescription and payment collection both.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. And I specifically thank you for helping us in organizing today's this video link and Zoom meeting. We are very much appreciative about the cooperation. Dr. Dipti, will you like to say something more about the posting? Dr. Dipti,
Yeah, I've been answering questions from the
panel.
from
Ah,
whatever were posted.
ah,
So I've tried to answer most of them. I think
mhm.
one of them here is by Dr. Akhil sir, who's asking about the use of methotrexate and liver damage. So yes, I think before we start any disease modifying drugs, we have to get the baseline test, which I said as the CBC. We check the LFTs, especially the SGOT, SGPT. So if the baseline to start off it is normal, then we start the medication. We usually start methotrexate at a dose of 15 milligrams per week. And then depending on after a month, I usually ask my patients to get the SGOT, SGPT and CBC repeated. If everything is okay and the disease activity I feel is not controlled and I need to increase, then I slowly increase from 15 milligrams to 20 milligrams.
Okay.
The maximum methotrexate you can use is 25 milligrams per week, both in oral or subcutaneous form.
Okay.
And we give Folvite with it. So folic acid is a definite when you give Folitrex. It has to be taken from Monday to Friday, and then you can use Folitrex just on the methotrexate just on the Saturday, something like that. We caution them about the use of alcohol when they are on the disease modifying drug, especially methotrexate. And then if you notice a change, so it's a trend basically. So we ask them to repeat it every month initially for the first 3 months, and then every 3 monthly. If you notice that the LFTs are slowly going up, then we usually tend to hold off, then stop the drug, repeat it after 2 weeks. Most of the times it's reversible, and then we then start or re-challenge the drug at a lower dose.
Uh,
So this is usually what we do.
Dr. Dipti, I have one question. When a patient is on this type of medications like methotrexate and all, and the patient walks in for some other complaint,
Yes.
What family physician must take care while prescribing them?
Yes, very good question. So when they're on disease modifying drugs, basically these are immunosuppressed patients, so they may not mount the response or the classical signs of the other conditions that they're presented with. So even a severe infection, they may not have a very high fever, or they may be more unwell, and probably their parameters may not look the same. So I think we have to be very mindful that if it's an immunosuppressed patients, then we have to take every symptom very seriously, and probably get the investigations much before than you would do for say anybody with fever. You would want to check a CBC and ensure that there is no neutropenia, because with these disease modifying drugs and the underlying infection, they could be neutropenic. So you need to and then you need to evaluate about their liver tests, so your SGOT, SGPT, renal status. And then if you're going to treat them for infection, I always counsel my patients, and when they are getting antibiotics, they should hold off their disease modifying drugs. So drugs, especially like methotrexate, if they're due on that Saturday, it is better to not take the medication, finish your antibiotic course, and then restart it once the infection has settled. So this is as simple as it gets. And the only interaction we say with methotrexate is that for urinary tract infection, ensure that you don't give methotrexate and trimethoprim together. So that is something to bear in mind. Yeah.
Ma'am, usually what happens whenever a patient is on such medicines, we are afraid that there may be toxic effects. So what will be the indication to advise patient to stop the methotrexate?
I think any simple infection, I always tell them, even if you've got a simple cold cough, you can stop your methotrexate. Usually sulfasalazine and hydroxychloroquine are very mild. So even if they're continued, then there's no problem. But as a safety net, even if you've got a viral infection, cold, cough, fever, then the best is to cease all treatment, including your biologics, including your disease modifying drugs, get the underlying condition sorted or let it wear off. And once you're feeling back to normal, those drugs can be restarted. So very simple. Any problem, just hold it off.
So
Yeah.
stopping and restarting will not have any bad effect on the progression of the rheumatism.
So I think we have to take that in balance. I think if it is just most of the infections 1 or 2 weeks, and we know that it's going to be. So for a patient who's been on long-standing treatment, 1 or 2 weeks missing out the medicine is probably not going to put them in a lot of catastrophe. So I think it is very reasonable to hold off and restart when you feel that it's comfortable. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. I request Dr. Ramesh Rajani, if there are no any other questions, to give the vote of thanks.
Sir, thank you very much. And madam, I have got one question.
Yes.
I heard some vaccination is coming in the market for rheumatoid arthritis.
Vaccination?
No?
No,
No.
I'm not aware about a vaccination for rheumatoid arthritis.
No.
No, I'm not aware about a vaccination.
But these biological equivalents are so costly that people do agree to go for it, or it is difficult to prescribe them.
See, I think the cost of biologics significantly in India, we have become the biggest, market for biosimilars. So basically, these
Biosimilars,
biologics
yes.
were original, and biosimilars are now because the originals have not got the patent anymore. We've got a lot of companies who can now actually distribute, and in fact, even our Indian companies can manufacture these molecules. So from what it was before, I think the cost has definitely dramatically come down. I know there is scope of more with a lot of competition, but anywhere a biologic can, cost around 15,000 per month for a therapy. It can range from 15 to around 25,000 probably per month, depending on which biologic you choose. So for most patients who are these young in their productive age group, they're suffering really. I think they cling on to really these drugs because they work wonders. They kind of, change their life completely, and they're at least able to go to work and then remain productive. So, they rather do that and utilize their money. So we've got a lot of patients who are suffering who opt for these therapy quite.
So, Dr. Dipti, a very lovely and informative lecture.
Thank you.
And you have given nice information, answered all the questions. So we thank you very much. Thank you, Rashmikant. Thank you, Shobha. Thank you, Akhil, and all my colleagues sitting here together. With the
And we
beautiful
must thank
smile on
Dr.
everybody's face,
Contractor.
we end this lecture today here.
Yeah, we must thank Dr. Akhil Contractor specifically for.
Akhil, thank you. Shobha, thank you.
Yeah.
Rashmikant, thank you. Dipti, thank you a lot.
He has
Thank
taken a lot of pain to organize today's program. Somehow or the other we have missed him today. But Dr. Dipti, we thank from everybody.
Yes,
And we look forward to another update from you.
sure.
From you, yes.
My pleasure, and Dr. Anita Gidwani madam for really contacting me and giving this opportunity. I'd like to thank her when I'm sure she's in the attendee list. Yes.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you,
Yes.
Anita Gidwani.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye. Goodbye to everybody.
Okay.
Okay,
Have a
bye.
good evening.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, last word. हम साथ साथ हैं.
हम
सब लोग
साथ
साथ हैं.
हैं. Yes, sir.